Good morning, everybody. I'm coming to you via YouTube because unfortunately for me I had a fall not last weekend but the weekend before, and that resulted in me being unable to attend class today when I'm supposed to be doing my presentation. So instead of me actually physically being in the class with you, this is what you get instead. I could talk for hours about the internet and the development of technology and the approach to the singularity, which is probably something that's not really going to be covered in this topic, but if you're interested, I will talk about it. But a brief summary of the internet is basically the military in the United States decided it would be a good idea if they distributed their knowledge over a bunch of computers in a bunch of different places and on a distributed network, so that if one site went down, the other sites would still have access to the information. This was such a great idea that universities basically jumped on top of it, and throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s it was pretty much the domain of universities, the military and probably the American government. And then along came the 1990s, where someone had the great idea to make it a little bit more accessible to the general user by putting almost a graphical user interface over the top of the internet, which is called the World Wide Web. Of course, most people these days, when they refer to the internet, they're actually talking about the World Wide Web and not the actual internet, which is a little bit more complicated than we see it to be. But one thing that the internet really did do for us in the long run is that it gave us a new platform to express ourselves, and as technology continues to advance and as it gets cheaper, it gets more accessible to more and more people, and that means we have more creators and more dreamers, more thinkers online than we've ever had before. Every year it probably increases. And given that technology, as well as advancing in complexity, it also decreases in price. So now we have amateur people able to make films, create websites to sell their wares, and just generally have access to an audience that they might not otherwise have had if they'd been just creating art in their home. So while back in the day, during the early stages of modernism, when people were writing manifestos, those manifestos would get published or distributed via leaflets or whatever other sorts of technologies they had access to. The audience that they could appeal to and give their ideas to was much smaller, because first you had to take into consideration distribution, how many people would get access to it. So the people who had access to these things were mostly the intellectuals, the academics, the elitists, the artists sitting in the cafe talking about things. Whereas now the audience is far larger, not just limited to elites. Your average person sitting in their living room can access pretty much all of the knowledge of mankind through their computer without doing much more than clicking on Google. Which brings me to today's topic, which is blog manifestos. I read the BuzzFeed article, I looked at pretty much all of the links there, and I was a little bit disappointed, I have to say. Some of the links were to people's sites trying to sell their books. Also, they were not necessarily their own work. For instance, one of them was an illustrated version of Salvador Dali's Surrealist Manifesto, which was very beautiful and very lovely, but it wasn't their own work, and I wouldn't really consider it online at all, because it's just basically regurgitating somebody else's work, maybe in a different manner, but you can buy posters anywhere pretty much. You can buy posters online, you can buy the poster and it will come to your house and you can hang it on your wall, but it's still not an online manifesto, because when it was originally written, it wasn't written online. It was written however Salvador Dali wrote his manifesto originally, which, knowing him, could have been like melting clocks or something. Anyway, so in the end I had to consider which blogs I was going to look at, and I chose three 3 that I thought reflects our time and our place in history, as opposed to things that reference older times and older places. So the 3 blogs I'm looking at today are the How to Be Alone, which is a video blog, or actually a performance of a spoken word poem by Tanya Davis. The DIY Manifesto, which is by ifixit.org, I think. And the Filmmakers Manifesto, which actually didn't link to the manifesto itself, it linked to a Wikipedia page of the manifesto. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about How to Be Alone. How to Be Alone is a spoken word poem which was written and performed by Tanya Davis and produced and filmed by Andrea Dorfman. Tanya Davis is as she, in her own words, poet, writer and singer of songs. She's Canadian, and in 2011 and 12 she was the Halifax Poet Laureate. The video was produced in 2010 and it had 8 million views, which is actually pretty respectable for a video of this type, especially given that it is now 7 years old. The main contention of this blog is that it's okay to be alone and that you should take the time to be alone, because you can experience things in life that you might not otherwise experience if you were always with somebody else. For instance, sitting on a bench, just being alone, you might find a stranger comes up and you have an interesting conversation that you might not have had if you hadn't been on that bench alone at the time. Being alone in this writer's contention is a way of experiencing the beauty of the world, the quietness, the gentleness that life can be. I thought it was very beautiful, and it really appealed to me as I think of myself as an introvert. A lot of young people especially, who use the internet, they are there because they are alone or they feel lonely, and it gives them a way to reach out to other people and not feel so alone, and find people that they have something in common with. This is especially true for the loners and the geeks and the queers. The second manifesto that I looked at was a DIY manifesto. This is interesting, and it's the sort of manifesto that could only be written in today's society. In our society, we really are not as conscientious as we could be about throwing things away, or recycling things, or using old things again, making them new. Modernist theory there. And a lot of high-tech items are made with planned obsolescence in mind. For instance, when the last time my contract ran out for my phone, rather than getting a new contract for my old phone, I got a new phone, because the new phone had more features that I was interested in and I wanted to use, and also because they were moving from 3G to 4G, and there's a whole lot of things like that. The technology advances, and as technology advances, we need new things to access the technology, which is the way it goes for our society. So the Do-It-Yourself Manifesto was interesting in that it advocates for people to be able to have the right to repair their own items, to fix things, rather than to throw them away or to recycle them, which I think is a very interesting, very pertinent sort of attitude to have in today's, the time and place of today. So it basically declares that people should have the right to be able to open up their phones, for instance, and perform repairs rather than taking it back to the manufacturer and having them perform the repairs. Apple, for instance, doesn't like you opening up their iPhones and iPads. They'd rather you take them back to the Apple store and have them repaired there, or replaced, or upgraded. That's the trick. They want you to upgrade. They want you to buy their latest and greatest. Because if you don't do that, then they're not making as much money as they could otherwise do. So this is why they do that. On the other hand, the DIY manifesto was inspired by 2 other manifestos, one of which was Mr. Jalopy's Maker's Bill of Rights, and the other one is Platform 21's Repair Manifesto. Now, I didn't look into Platform 21's, But Mr. Jalopy's Maker's Bill of Rights was originally written for a magazine called Make, and that's the maker that this particular bill refers to. The person who reproduced this manifesto went on to say that he used to work for a corporation that repaired their own things. And essentially he had his own view, which was most people are stupid and that we should really leave the repair up to the experts, which is actually quite true. You never know, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get when you go to a third-party repairer. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But I thought it was interesting in that it addressed the whole notion of the throwaway society that we live in at the moment, and that people should think about how they can reuse items that they already have, or repair items that are broken, rather than throwing them out and getting a new one. Even though, and the sad thing is, it's often cheaper to buy a new one than to repair an old one. The last manifesto that I looked at from the BuzzFeed list was the Filmmakers Manifesto, which, as BuzzFeed has done with a number of the manifestos on their list, is actually called the Dogme 95 Manifesto. And there was another one written at about the same time for the same movement called Vows of Chastity. It was originally written by Danish directors Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg. I'm sorry if I'm looking off to the side, that's where my notes are. And they're basically rules for filmmaking based on traditional values such as the story, the acting and the theme, without the use of elaborate special effects. Apparently, dogme is a Danish word for dogma, which makes sense, perfect sense for a manifesto. They are rather dogmatic in their rules for filmmaking. The manifesto itself was written in 45 minutes in 1995, which was pretty much just as the internet was starting to become a thing in people's homes. As for it shares something in common with the DIY manifesto in that they're both written at times where really technology is starting to become more affordable and available to more people. And that means that amateurs can make their own films. And a lot of the rules for the Dogme 95 manifesto would apply to modern filmmakers who might not have the sort of funding or resources that are accessible to the bigger studios. So a lot of the rules actually make a lot of sense. And essentially they're rules for making cheap films, which isn't a bad thing because cheap films can sometimes be better than big old blockbusters. As I was saying, basically the modern technology makes filmmaking much easier and much more accessible to a larger number of filmmakers. And to be perfectly honest, one of the subjects that I did when I was still at Victoria University involved me making a short film on a prosumer level camera, which is the level of technology that sits between consumer and professional. And the funny thing is, a couple of years later, I bought a camera that was pretty much exactly the same as the one I used to shoot my film on. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside there. Online. Yes. This is the thing. Now people are actually able to make films online. These rules are very useful. Now, I think that's pretty much all I've got to say about all of those three blogs, which weren't really blogs. The first one was a spoken word poetry set to music. The second one was a poster, and the third one, a poster for a website that's dedicated to giving people information about fixing things, which is probably something that I should have said in the middle of talking about it, but there you go, I just remembered it then. And the third one is basically about amateur filmmaking, regardless of whether these people were professionals or not, or whether they intended their rules for professionals. These rules are very good for amateur filmmakers. They give a different style and a different aesthetic to a more polished film. So, of course, one of the things that we had to do for this was ask a couple of questions. So what I would suggest is I will ask the question, you pause the video and discuss it in class, and then you start the video again and I will give you my answers. So first question I came up with is, would you consider writing a manifesto, or anything at all really, and making it available online to the public for free? I'm not sure that I'd really write a manifesto online, although it's possible that some of my writing may one day be online and be a manifesto, because look, let's face it, I've written at least one manifesto already, and there's a manifesto for this subject as an assessment piece. So it's entirely possible that that manifesto will end up online. On the subject of anything else, well, I have already done that in the form of fan fiction. I have I think I've published 4 or 5 pieces online, and I don't get anything for them except the kudos, which, you know, I could do with more exposure, but I don't know how to get myself more exposed. Ooh, that didn't come out right. Anyway, let's move on to the second question. Remember to pause at the end of the question and discuss it in class before listening to my answer, at least. That would be nice. The second question, in what ways do you think modern technology has changed the way we create aside from the obvious? Now, in my mind, the obvious is basically the way that the access to technology, and the fact that we have higher levels of technology available for cheaper and cheaper prices, which means more and more people can use them. Honestly, I think that the development of technology has really given us a lot more flexibility. A person doesn't have to be pigeonholed into being just a writer. They can be a writer and a film producer, or they can be a writer and a journalist, a writer of fiction and a journalist. They can be teachers, or really just anything. You're only limited by your imagination. So you could be a writer and a game developer. You could, and the other thing is that it opens up opens up creative communities to other people who are creating, and not just within their own profession, but into other professional areas. For instance, I'm a writer, but I know people who are in the maker community, and I know people who in the filmmaking community, and I know people who are bloggers. My mother has a blog. Every man and their dog has a blog these days, it seems. So that's basically where I see the technology has changed the way we create. And as far as manifestos specifically go, well, the sky's the limit. You could make just about anything into a manifesto these days. So, sorry I couldn't be there, but it is what it is, and I hope you all have a good week. And I might see some of you on Friday, and if not, I will probably certainly see you the following Monday if there's a class. I don't know if there's a class. Anyway, bye!